With the secession of East Pakistan and Yahya Khan's ouster, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and the PPP assumed control of the government. The new government would first exercise authority as an interim martial law administration from the 20th of December 1971 to the 14th of August 1973, and after that time as a constitutional parliamentary government until the 5th of July 1977. Bhutto would serve as president and CMLA during the first phase and prime minister during the second. On the external front, the new government had to immediately address ending hostilities with India, secure the repatriation of 93,000 Pakistani POWs, and work towards normalization of relations with Bangladesh. Bhutto clearly understood that Pakistan's attempt to create and maintain a balance of power in South Asia through conventional means had failed. Rather than accept India's hegemony, however, Bhutto was determined to buy time through diplomacy while embarking upon a nuclear weapons program. Pakistan vowed to succeed on this front, even if it had to endure hardships to achieve its goal. To the new government's credit, it successfully negotiated the Simla Agreement with India, July 1972, which was sufficiently vague and allowed both states to claim that their view of the Kashmir dispute had been endorsed. By August 1973, Pakistan had successfully negotiated for the return of its POWs from India and shielded those accused by Bangladesh of war crimes, with the transfer completed by July 1974. Meanwhile, at the Organization of Islamic Conference Summit in Lahore in February 1974, Mujibur Rahman was invited to attend, and Pakistan formally recognized Bangladesh. Bhutto would also take steps to deepen Pakistan's relationship with China, especially in terms of military cooperation and infrastructure development. A major project that had been initiated under the Ayub Khan regime, the 1,300 km long National Highway 35, popularly known as the Karakoram Highway, underwent rapid development during the PPP administration, although it was not completed until 1979. This provided China and Pakistan with a direct overland link. The deepening of relations with China contrasted with the difficult relationship with the USA, especially after the Indian nuclear test of 1974 created concerns that Pakistan would follow suit. Since the passage of the 1976 Symington Amendment to the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, Pakistan had to face increased pressure regarding its nuclear program. Internally, the new government embarked upon a program of consolidating power and reducing or co-opting potential sources of opposition. The civil service, the industrial and business classes, and the military were the key elements from which the PPP perceived a serious threat. The plan was to cut down the pillars of the old regime and to bind the state apparatus, the economy, and the military to a political patronage complex centered on the ruling party. By doing so, Bhutto hoped to overwhelm any serious opposition to his rule and stay in power indefinitely, with periodic elections to sanctify this continuity in power. Given the arbitrariness that this approach would entail, Bhutto decided to use his powers as CMLA to strike the first blows against what he believed to be the actual or potential enemies of his government. The purge of the civilian apparatus began in December 1971, and in its first week the chairman of the Pakistan Industrial Development Corporation and National Press Trust, the managing directors of the National Shipping Group and Progressive Papers, and the senior editor of Pakistan Times were all sacked. All the dismissals were carried out under martial law orders. Bhutto then directed Waqar Ahmed, the secretary to the cabinet, to prepare names of civil servants for dismissal or demotion, en masse, under Martial Law Regulation 114. When Ahmed tried to pressure the heads of administrative departments to submit names, a mere 27 names were yielded. The special police establishment yielded 88 names. The finance minister submitted 106 names, and Ahmed added 245 names on his own initiative. Senior PPP leaders were also asked to add names to the list, and on the 12th of March 1972, some 2,000 officials learned from the evening broadcast that they had been dismissed or demoted. On the 18th of March, some 500 provincial services officers met the same fate. Then, on the 18th of April, a total of 24 judges were removed, while 2 days later, 8 officers of the Intelligence Bureau were dismissed. These purges were followed by the lateral entry scheme, through which the political leadership could make direct appointments, circumventing the normal competitive recruitment procedures. At the officer and senior subordinate levels, 5,476 such inductions were made, with some 2,800 in federal institutions and the rest at the provincial level. These purges and political inductions were designed to reduce the autonomy and prestige of the civilian bureaucracy, while the 1973 Civil Service Act and Public Service Commissions Act gutted the statutory autonomy and rigor of the services. The business and industrial classes also felt Bhutto's ire. The new government adopted a confiscatory policy of nationalization in Pakistan's banking, shipping, insurance and large-scale manufacturing industries, while missionary schools were brought under state ownership. By the mid-1970s, as even small and medium-sized enterprises faced nationalization, private investment declined dramatically, and the newly nationalized entities, as well as older state corporations, were soon too bloated with political appointees to perform efficiently. As the state sector was turned into the major source of employment generation, deficits soared, and by 1977, revenue stood at about one-half of expenditures, with fiscal deficits as a proportion of GDP in the double digits. The gaps were made good through printing currency and borrowing, which fueled inflation that hurt the poorest Pakistanis the most. The poorest quintile saw its share of the national wealth fall back to 6%, the pre-Ayub Khan level, while Pakistan's industrial revolution stalled, never to be effectively revived, and a permanent crisis of productivity and competitiveness now permeated the entire economy. Somewhat ironically, for a government that claimed socialism to be its economic policy, the 5-year planning process was abandoned and replaced by an ad hoc 1-year planning approach. The government's approach towards the military was different from the outright aggression demonstrated towards the civil service and businessmen. The first tack of the strategy was to buy the military's support by increasing its funding, giving it a share of nationalized industries, grants of land and privileges. The second tack was to create a new paramilitary Praetorian Guard, called the Federal Security Force, FSF, that would be personally loyal to Bhutto and deter coup attempts. By late 1976, the FSF had 18,500 men under arms, 750 vehicles, its own radio wireless network, and heavy weapons. Tanks had been purchased for it, but their entry into service was delayed due to high operating costs. On the patronage side of the equation, the government would employ 3,000 former military men in the FSF and also use the nationalized banks and industries as parking places for surplus military officers. The military budget rose from Rs 3,000 M in 1972 to Rs 8,000 M by 1976, and schemes to provide land to military personnel were expanded. The military's welfare foundations flourished under the patronage economy established by the PPP. The Army's Fauji Foundation, for instance, saw its assets grow from Rs 152 NM in 1970 to more than Rs 2,000 M by 1982, with 29 major industrial projects under its control. The government's deployment of the military in Balochistan to crush opposition in 1973 would also set the stage for its rehabilitation as a fighting force in the eyes of the public, rapidly replenishing its political capital from the low point of December 1971. Bhutto's undermining of civilian administrative and economic capacity and strengthening of the military was accompanied by measures that made the adoption of a new constitution in 1973 almost meaningless. The military regime-era Defense of Pakistan rules remained in effect. The Code of Criminal Procedure was amended to allow for direct registration of cases without preliminary examination by a magistrate. Citizens lost legal protection against mala-fide arrest in April 1974, and strenuous efforts were made to buy the support of the legal fraternity through grants of plots of land. The use of religion as an instrument of shoring up political support led to the establishment of a federal ministry for religious affairs, the declaration of Ahmadis as non-Muslim by Constitutional Amendment 1974, and, as the government faced mounting opposition, prohibitions on alcohol, gambling and horse racing were also introduced. The inability of the government to adhere to any consistent principle beyond a tactical need for self-aggrandizement paved the way for its downfall. Two developments were critical in this respect. One was that in 1976, the army chief, General Tika Khan, was due to retire, and Bhutto wanted to replace him with a pliant and politically reliable officer. In March of that year, Bhutto decided to appoint Lieutenant General Zia-ul-Haq as Tika Khan's successor. This meant that Zia superseded 6 more senior lieutenant generals. The second critical development was the conduct of the next general elections. These were scheduled for March 1977, and in October 1976, a clear message was sent to the civilian bureaucracy through the purge of 170 officers. What was expected was blind loyalty to the government, and another purge was planned for immediately after the elections. The opposition parties formed the Pakistan National Alliance, PNA, to contest the elections. Nobody seriously expected the PNA to win the elections, and the PPP had no cause for concern that it would lose its majority. The polling day and post-poll rigging that took place much of it by terrified civil administrators, produced a result where the PPP won 155 seats and the combined opposition only 36 seats in a reduced 216-member National Assembly. This resulted in mass agitation against the government, with the authorities resorting to repression as well as offers of negotiation to defuse the challenge. In April 1977, the government imposed martial law in Karachi and Lahore, and the political crisis deepened. Calls for the army to intervene grew, and while Zia was a relatively reluctant coup-maker, the growing consensus among his colleagues convinced him to strike. In July, the military staged a coup, codenamed Operation Fair Play, which toppled the government and installed Zia as the CMLA. Zia promised fresh elections in 90 days. These 90 days would turn into 11 years and end only with Zia's death in an unexplained air crash in August 1988.